Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm Group Captain Blythe Crawford. I'm the Station Commander at RAF Leeming up in North Yorkshire. And I wanted to give you a quick overview today of what we've tried to do here in establishing the RAF's first innovation hub that is known as RAFX. You're not cool these days unless you've got an X at the end of your name. So a little bit of background, first of all. So I came to this job from working in Washington, D.C., where I was part of the DoD's team setting up the innovation strategy for the US Air Force. So finishing my time in Washington, they decided, hey, send it back to the UK and we want you to offload everything on the UK, what you learned working stateside. So I got tasked with taking over RAF Leeming and setting up RAFX, as we call it, so the innovation hub for the Royal Air Force. A little bit of background, though, on the Royal Air Force itself. So our roots are actually in innovation and technical advancement. So we were born out of the World War I in 1918 and born out of innovation in itself. And actually, there's a personal attachment to that picture top left. That's one of my ancestors taking probably the first ever selfie in the back of an aircraft over the Battle of the Somme in 1916. But then all the way through the 20th century, the Royal Air Force and defence in general was at the sort of leading edge of innovation, whether that be the invention of radar, the jet engine, through to space flight from the American perspective, the establishment of GPS and the internet, and then all the way now to the development of AI and things like quantum. But the challenge we have now is that the pace of change in the civilian sector has rapidly overtaken that in terms of defence. And we liken it to what we call a red queen problem. If you remember back to Alice Through the Looking Glass, where basically you have to run as fast as you can to stay in the same place. And if you want to go somewhere else, you need to run twice as fast as that. So that's the challenge that we have, I think, in the MOD today, is the fact that the pace of change is so great in the outside world, we have to sprint to try and keep up. And some of the old methodologies that we had for driving forward some of that digital transformation do not work. So therefore, we need to change our processes to be more relevant. Just a quick overview of the RAF's Innovation Enterprise. We have mirrored it to a degree on the way that the US are doing theirs. We set up the Royal Air Force Rapid Capabilities Office, which is very much focused at pulling through technologies a little bit quicker, things that are already at a high TRL level and available in Civvy Street. We then also set up a team called Team Tempest, which is looking at the next generation platform and working in conjunction with some significantly large, let's say, defense primes in terms of that development. And then AIX, which is about air information experimentation. So moving towards a cloud-based system where we can then apply AI algorithms, et cetera, to our data sets and allow us to process the amount of information we're gathering a lot more quickly. But the one thing that I thought was missing was actually where we go and experiment at the edge. So how do I take a really good idea that one of my team have, experiment with it, allow it to fail fast, fail early, develop it into an MVP, and then scale it across the rest of the service? And that's where RAFX came from in terms of setting up that innovation hub. The other challenge we had is we had various ideas like this in the past, and previous initiatives included a focus on the conceptual components. We had a concept called Thinking to Win, which we ran a couple of years ago, which was great in the fact that it got people thinking a little bit more, but nobody was actually turning those great ideas actually into something tangible at the end of it. Part of the reason being that some of our processes were wedded to 1970s, 1980s methodologies. So actually thinking about how we turn those ideas into something tangible was something we had to address. Likewise, we recently set up a platform called Blue Skies and another platform called Defense Ideas, which at least gives you a platform to put those ideas onto. But again, who takes those ideas and turns them into something tangible? And that's one of the things that we really want to focus on with RAFX, particularly now as we move towards the digital age and not just looking at digitization, but digitalization and actually addressing the processes that we have ourselves, as well as the just turning them into digital from paper. There was also a lot of discussion going on about what we actually meant by innovation. And people thought it was just something that you did. So I had several people come up to me and say that, I'm in charge of innovation in the Air Force. And the challenge was, well, what does that actually mean? And people do tend to muddy the water between invention and innovation. In my mind, innovation has got to be against something. So you've got to do it against a problem, against an idea, or an opportunity to use a new technology in a way that it wasn't necessarily designed for. So you don't just go innovate. You've got to have a problem set to innovate against in the first instance. So that's where we can take some of those ideas and challenges that the Air Force has and actually turn them into something tangible. Another discussion that we had was, do you do this bottom up or do you do it top down? And again, we had two camps when I was looking at this in Washington. There was a team that said, no, it's got to be top down driven. We need a strategy. We need a chief innovation officer. We need to have a whole series of meetings and a plan as to how we're going to roll this out. There were others, though, on the other hand, that said, no, we just need to cut the shackles of everybody that works in the service and allow them to come up with the ideas themselves and push those up. So basically remove all the barriers and the red tape that prevent them from solving their problems and the world be a better place. What I've discovered is you've got to do a little bit of both, because the problem is that the top down sets the strategic direction. And if you just do top down, you end up with an organization that at least knows where it's going, but not necessarily the happiest organization in the world. If you just do bottom up, you end up with a very happy organization, which doesn't have a strategy and doesn't have a way to take that process forward. So you've got to do a little bit of both. And what I've found, particularly with trying to drive cultural change, is that you've got to do a little bit of the bottom up, first of all, because what that does is allows people to see a tangible difference being made from their ideas, and then they're hooked on the idea of innovation in itself. So a little bit of bottom up, followed by a little bit of top down, and then massage it as appropriate as you try to take your organization forward. The other 5 key areas that I thought that you needed to innovate, and this came out of some of the work I did in the US, were time, space, education, training, leadership, buy-in, and resource. And I put time first for a reason, because time is the one thing that everybody says they don't have enough of. The reason I think in some of our organizations is that we don't have time is because we're spending all our time wedded to 1980s processes and structures and technology. And actually, we need to stop for a second, fix some of that, and then build time into our processes to allow us to address the problem sets we have. So a little bit like the Google 80-20 model that people talk about, building that time in to actually fix your processes and drive forward positive change. I've got space on there as well, because some of the problem sets that we have and that we have tried to address within the Air Force, if you try and solve it in your own workspace, you're already culturally bound by processes, by the context in which you're working, and you don't necessarily think a little bit more outside the box in terms of how that problem can be solved. And that's where diversity comes into the equation as well. And what I've discovered since doing the process here at Leeming is that the more we include people from outside the service and the organization across all strands of life, particularly leveraging some of our reservists, and we have much more opportunity to make a positive contribution. Education and training is something that people tend to forget about, but I think it's one of the most important elements of it. Because again, going back to my point, if I just said, go off and innovate against a problem set, 90% of us would probably fail at the first instance to try and, let's say, build that tower out of spaghetti and a marshmallow, which is a traditional one that people do to show this process. What we need to do is to allow our organization to fail fast and fail early, particularly for a government organization where we don't want to be wasting taxpayers' money on pink elephants or great big ideas that end up being too big to fail. So the more we can de-risk that in the earliest opportunities, the better. So, for example, through our own RAFX model, we've been following lean startup methodology and using that as the basis to fail fast and fail early. We also need leadership buy-in, and we need leadership buy-in right across the organization, not just at the upper levels. One of the things that we suffered from, again, when I was looking at this in the US, was the frozen middle. People who have been in the organization too long, or long enough that they get basically wedded to the culture that existed before, and you end up with the scenario of computer says no at every turn. The other challenge that we have is in a hierarchical organization, we have multiple paths to no, but only one path to yes. And we're very fortunate to have Jeff Bezos come and chat to us about how they do that in Amazon. And the point that he made was, in a hierarchical organization like ours, you've got to get it through every single layer of the bureaucracy to get your idea approved or taken forward. Whereas in Silicon Valley, he just has to find one venture capitalist that bites off on his idea, and then his idea becomes a success. So we need to look at, do we actually flatten the organization, or do we have mechanisms such that you don't have your idea turned off just because one person in the loop decides that it's not a good way to go forward? And then finally, resource. And I put resource last for a reason, because again, a lesson that I took from when we tried this in the US was that we put resource first. And we spent an awful lot of money buying iPads because everybody decided that you needed an iPad to innovate effectively. My point being that we need to go through all of these other processes, first of all, particularly that education and training piece, so that we don't spend money unnecessarily and that our resource goes to where it actually should be spent, particularly when you're spending taxpayers' money. The other challenge we have was, how do you innovate in an organization that has a continual output? And there's a really good book that I must admit I leveraged called The Other Side of Innovation that talks about your organization being the continuous performance engine. So what I've done with RAFX is set up a permanent innovation team, so people who are skilled in methodologies to try and drive innovation forward. And then against the problem set that we have, we create cross-functional teams who are empowered, enabled, and diverse. We pull those from the continuous performance engine. They run sprints against the problem sets. They then get taken through the process by the permanent innovation team, and then we feed it back into the continuous performance engine to beta tested before we would then potentially scale it across the rest of the organization. In terms of the process that we follow, again, a lot of you will recognize the lean startup methodology there, inspired obviously by Steve Blank, who initially came up with the concept, developed further by Eric Ries. And the principles we apply are based on those, the 5 whys by Simon Sinek, so starting with why each time. And again, we were quite fortunate to have people from Google come and explain to us the sort of things that we should be looking at from innovation enterprises. 3 big questions: does it work? Does it perform better than what it's replacing? And are people using it? And if you can't answer all 3, well, then you need to think about pivoting to something else. And then, of course, if we want to sound a little bit like Silicon Valley, does it bring you joy as well? Because obviously the user's got to have a joyful experience in terms of using that application or that tool, and also being aware that not one methodology will solve every problem. So we need to have an innovation team that is skilled across multiple disciplines. But if I go away and do all of this and just do it inside my own organization, I think we'll struggle, particularly going back to my Red Queen point about how we need to sprint just to stay in the same place. So one of the things that I jumped upon, particularly being based right in the middle of the Vale of the York there, where you can see the red star, which we've actually rechristened Silicon Vale, because I immediately found that I was surrounded by some absolute brilliance, particularly in big data analytics and particularly in AI, in the surrounding region. So why would we not work hand in hand with those in the region to try and take our ideas forward? You might recognize the National Innovation Center for Data, Helix there in the north, that's up in Newcastle. An amazing building with thousands of sensors within the building itself, which means it's a living, breathing thing. Durham, just below that, have obviously set up their own innovation downtown center, and Durham University are currently studying black holes, which mean that they're modeling the universe. So if anybody wants to look at a big data set, Durham's got one of the biggest in the country. Teesside University's on there as well, actually one of the world's leading gaming universities. So when you start looking at augmented reality or gaming for some of your technologies you want to take forward, they are a world leader. And then obviously Leeds in terms of AI, and we're doing some stuff with them on 5G. And then likewise, York is there as well, who were doing some stuff on the ethics of human augmentation. And then finally, Sheffield is on there too. We're working with the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre at Sheffield to try and take forward some of the technologies that we've been working on collaboratively. So when you think about it, we've got the perfect triangle there of us with the problems, all the academic brilliance of the North and Northeast to try and leverage to take that forward. And there is funding available to try and support that as well through the Defence Innovation Fund, which is 80 million over 10 years, some of the DASA challenges, and then obviously leveraging Innovate UK as well. And just to give you an idea of some of the problems that we're addressing at the moment, one of the first ones is digitalizing our data. So we are still a very paper-based organization, and actually a lot of our policies and rules and regulations around that are still wedded to the paper process. So digitalizing those processes and then the data, so as we make better use of it, employing AI as appropriate is absolutely the way forward. I'm also one of the senior owners of the delivery of the Hawk aircraft, which is getting on a bit. So one of the things I want to look at is how we better look after our spare components for that. So creating a digital twin of that platform is absolutely a way forward. Again, I talked about some of the work we were doing with the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, and we've developed an app with them which can do anomaly detection across the surface of a platform, which saves a lot of time going over it bolt by bolt. So again, some great opportunities there. But it's not just in the technical end, and we're also working with Durham University and the Wolfson Institute for Mental Health and Wellbeing on looking after our people and looking at a mental health and wellbeing app there, which employs AI to look at bespoke opportunities and packages for individuals. There's also a heavy look on renewable energy and sustainability, again, primarily with Newcastle University, where we're looking at carbon capture across the airfield, but also looking at sensors that can then feed back into a central database to manage, let's say, our carbon footprint and make sure that we're balancing that and offsetting it appropriately. And then likewise, we've been trialing e-scooters with Lime, and also looking at electric vehicles across the site. And then on some of the more sort of complex tasks, looking at things like the aggregation of subjective intelligence, which is something that we don't tend to do on a routine basis in terms of some of our command and control functions. So as you can see there, a lot of our problem sets are focused towards big data analytics and AI, but mostly in a support mechanism rather than necessarily on a front-end capability. But finally, the important thing as well there is we talked a lot about technology, but we also need to focus on our people. So what are the opportunities for taking that forward? We've developed a coding scheme with the J-Hub, which is a joint innovation function down in London, looking at how we can actually train our people in online packages to learn coding languages like Python and C++. We're also providing and pairing up with outside organizations such as National Innovation Centre for Data on training our people how to manage big data. And then we are slightly behind with this at the moment, but the US have already taken forward some work with MIT to then train their people up to actually develop artificial intelligence algorithms as well. And I am exploring that with some of my team here to look at how we can to do that more effectively to track aircraft accidents, for example, so that we don't make the same mistakes over and over again. So the people element of that is very important as well. Very conscious of time, and I know we kind of skipped over quite a lot there, but I thought hopefully that will have given you a pretty clear overview of how we're trying to drive forward digital innovation within the Air Force, and I'm now open for any questions.